Life can change in an instant. Unexpected news, a symptom that appears out of nowhere, a diagnosis that overturns all certainties. Illness has this power. It arrives without warning, changes routines, destroys dreams, and tests the limits of faith. Faced with it, many wonder where to find refuge, how to overcome fear, and above all, where God is in the midst of pain. Is there a promise capable of bringing relief, healing, and protection? Is there a divine word strong enough to restore the body and soul? Throughout history, countless people have sought comfort in the scriptures in times of illness. Among all sacred texts, one stands out as a shield against evil, a fortress for those who cry out for help, the 91st Psalm. Its words carry the promise of divine protection, a guarantee that those who dwell under the shadow of the Most High will be guarded against visible and invisible threats. But what makes this psalm so powerful? Why is it recited in hospitals, read by the sick, and spoken by those facing difficult times? To understand the power of this psalm, it is first necessary to recognize the spiritual and emotional battle that illness brings. Human suffering has always been present, from ancient times to the present day. The disease does not choose age, social class, or belief. It affects the rich and the poor, the strong and the weak. But, in the midst of this reality, the Bible teaches us that God does not abandon us. On the contrary, He reveals Himself as a safe refuge, an ever-present help in tribulation. The 91st Psalm begins with a declaration of absolute confidence. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. These words are not just ancient poetry. They carry a profound truth. There is a place of protection reserved for those who fully trust in God. But what does it mean to dwell in this hiding place? How can we find rest under the shadow of the Almighty? The answer is in total surrender. Many seek God only in moments of despair, as if He were a last resort when all other solutions fail. However, Psalm 91 talks about an ongoing relationship, a dwelling in the divine presence. It is not a temporary refuge, but a permanent home. Those who make God their shelter find peace, even in the midst of the storm. This promise becomes even more impactful when the psalmist describes deliverance from the fowler's snare and the deadly pestilence. Here he uses two powerful images. The fowler's snare represents hidden traps, dangers that cannot be seen with the naked eye. The pernicious plague symbolizes diseases and calamities that devastate entire communities. In other words, the psalm guarantees protection against threats that are invisible and unpredictable. If we look at the world today, we see how current these words continue to be. Epidemics, pandemics, silent diseases that strike without warning. The fear of illness is real, and it is often more destructive than the illness itself. The 91st Psalm, however, reminds us that God not only sees these threats, but also promises deliverance. This means that those who trust Him can face any situation with the knowledge that they are not alone. Another fundamental aspect of this psalm is its emphasis on trust. Often, illness is accompanied by doubts and anguish. The fear of the future, the uncertainty about healing, the fragility of the body that reminds us of our vulnerability. But God's promise is clear. He covers us with His feathers, and under His wings we find safety. This is an image of intimate care, similar to that of a bird protecting its young from danger. However, this protection does not mean the absence of battles. The psalmist does not say that those who trust in God will never face difficulties, but rather that they will be sustained in the midst of them. Healing can come in unexpected ways. Sometimes it is a complete restoration of the body. Other times, it is a supernatural peace that strengthens the soul to withstand any challenge. In both cases, the presence of God is the greatest guarantee of victory. Many people recite the 91st Psalm as a prayer of protection. They declare each word with faith, believing that the divine promise will become reality in their lives. But the true strength of this psalm is not just in the repetition of its verses, but in the trust in the God who inspired these words. He is faithful. He is powerful. He is the one who sustains, heals, and strengthens. In light of all this, an essential question arises. How can we appropriate this promise? How can we transform the 91st Psalm into a living reality and not just a pretty text? This is an invitation to a deep dive into faith, a call to dwell in the presence of the Most High and trust that, regardless of the circumstances, He remains a God of miracles. Psalm 91 did not come out of nowhere. Like every sacred text, it has a history, a context, and a motivation behind its words. To fully understand its message, we need to travel back in time and understand what kind of world these words were written in. Who was the author of this psalm? What was he facing? What dangers lurked around your people? Jewish tradition attributes the authorship of Psalm 91 to Moses, the great leader of Israel, the one who led the Hebrew people across the desert towards the Promised Land. If this tradition is correct, it means that these words were written during one of the most challenging periods in the history of God's people. The desert was a place of trial. There, hunger, thirst, and disease were constant threats. Epidemics could emerge without warning, and without doctors or advanced resources, the people depended solely on divine intervention to survive. If we think about the trajectory of Moses, we see a leader who knew both the power of God and the difficulties of human life. He saw plagues ravage Egypt, he saw the sea part, and he received the tablets of the law on Mount Sinai. But he also faced rebellions, had to deal with an impatient people, and saw many fall along the way. In the midst of so many trials, Moses' only certainty was this: God was with him. This conviction is reflected in every verse of the 91st Psalm. The psalmist is not talking about a theoretical or abstract faith. He is talking about a real experience lived in the middle of the desert, where danger was constant and the presence of God was the only source of security. But there is another theory about the authorship of this psalm. Some scholars suggest that it may have been written later, perhaps in the time of King David. This possibility also makes sense, as David was a man accustomed to facing threats. He spent years running from Saul, faced wars, and saw plagues hit his nation. For him, trusting God was not just an option, it was a necessity. Regardless of who wrote the psalm, the context in which it was generated is evident. A time of danger, where illnesses and calamities were constant. Life in the ancient world was much more fragile than it is today. A simple fever could be fatal. Epidemics could devastate entire cities. There were no hospitals, antibiotics, or vaccines. Medicine was rudimentary, and people often turned to healers or religious rituals in an attempt to protect themselves. Within this reality, the Hebrews had something that differentiated them from other peoples: the certainty that they were under the protection of the living God. They did not rely on amulets, superstitions, or witchcraft. His confidence was in the covenant with the Lord. When plagues ravaged the land, they remembered God's promises. When death haunted their homes, they declared the fidelity of the Most High. Psalm 91 reflects this mindset. He does not deny the existence of danger, but affirms that there is a safe haven for those who place themselves under divine protection. This becomes clear when he talks about the pernicious plague and the night terror. These terms are not mere figures of speech. In the ancient world, many diseases appeared in mysterious ways. Without the scientific knowledge we have today, plagues were seen as invisible forces, unexpected attacks that led to people dying without explanation. The fear of these plagues was so great that in many cultures, people believed they were sent by angry gods or evil spirits. Some civilizations performed human sacrifices in an attempt to appease these forces. Others burned entire cities in the hope of containing contamination. The fear of the disease was real and uncontrollable. However, the people of Israel had a different perspective. For them, God was not a distant or cruel being. He was a father who cared for his children. And Psalm 91 was proof of this protection. He stated that God would protect his people, that the plague would not reach their homes, and that those who trusted in the Lord would be spared the terror that ravaged the neighboring nations. This promise did not mean that the Hebrews never got sick, but it meant they weren't at the mercy of chance. Their fate did not depend on invisible forces or the whim of pagan gods. They belonged to the Lord, and that made all the difference. Throughout history, this psalm has remained a shield for those facing difficult times. During periods of epidemics and pestilence, entire communities gathered to recite it. During the Middle Ages, when the Black Death ravaged Europe, many Christians declared these words as a form of protection. In times of war, soldiers carried with them small pieces of paper with the 91st Psalm written on it, believing it would keep them safe on the battlefield. But this promise goes beyond physical protection. The psalm does not just speak of deliverance from diseases and external dangers. He speaks of a spiritual refuge, of a peace that can only be found in the presence of God. In a world where the fear of death has always existed, this certainty was a balm for the soul. Nowadays, we live in an era of medical and scientific advances. We have access to treatments, vaccines, and cutting-edge technology. But, despite all the accumulated knowledge, the fear of illness is still present. New diseases emerge, epidemics still shake the world, and human beings remain vulnerable. At times like these, the words of Psalm 91 become more relevant than ever. They remind us that, above any human resource, there is a God who continues to be our refuge and strength. When the psalmist declares that no evil shall befall you, neither shall any plague come near your tent, he is inviting us to trust in that truth. He is not offering a magic formula against illness, but rather a promise that those who dwell in the presence of God will find safety, even amidst the storms of life. This is the essence of the 91st Psalm. It is not just an ancient text, but a statement of faith. It is not just a prayer, but a commitment to trust God above any circumstance. And those who understand this message discover that no matter what they face, they can find peace beneath the wings of the Almighty. The strength of Psalm 91 lies in its promises. Each word carries a deep spiritual weight, a declaration of confidence that transcends fear and uncertainty. In times of illness, it is natural for the human heart to seek refuge. Pain and weakness remind us of our vulnerability, and the search for healing becomes an urgent need. But what does this psalm really promise about health? Is it just comforting poetry, or a reality that can transform lives? From the beginning, the psalm establishes a fundamental principle. God's protection is real and accessible to those who trust in Him. He will deliver you from the fowler's snare and from the deadly pestilence. These words are not just abstract metaphors, they speak directly about deliverance from invisible traps and destructive diseases. In the ancient world, plagues appeared unexpectedly, and the lack of knowledge about their causes increased fear even more. Medicine was limited, and the only hope for many was to turn to faith. The psalmist then makes a bold statement. God has the power to preserve those who are under His shadow. The mention of the pernicious plague reveals something important. The author of the psalm does not ignore the existence of illnesses. He does not deny the danger or minimize the seriousness of the situations. On the contrary, he recognizes that there are destructive forces in the world, but declares that God's people are not helpless. This promise does not mean that we will never face illness, but rather that we have a safe haven, a source of hope that sustains us, even in the most difficult times. Another powerful verse says, "No harm will come to you, nor will any plague come near your tent." This is one of the most cited passages in times of pandemic and health crisis. But what does it really mean? Many interpret this verse as a guarantee that those who trust in God will never get sick. However, the Bible shows us that even faithful servants experienced illness. Job, a righteous man, suffered from intense physical pain. The Apostle Paul faced a thorn in the flesh that many believe was a chronic illness. Timothy, a young leader in the early church, needed guidance on how to deal with frequent stomach problems. So how do we reconcile the promise of Psalm 91 with these realities? The answer lies in the understanding that divine protection does not mean a total absence of suffering, but rather greater security in the midst of difficulties. When God declares, we rest in the certainty that He is in control. This is the true healing that Psalm 91 offers, a restoration that goes beyond the physical, reaching our soul and our spirit. The words of this psalm have crossed centuries because its message remains current. Even today, we live in a world marked by illness and tragedy. Science has advanced, but human vulnerability remains. In times of crisis, this psalm remains an anchor for those who choose to trust God. He reminds us that we are not alone, that there is a safe haven, and that there is a God who watches over us. And that's the greatest promise of all. No matter what challenges arise, no matter how uncertain the future, there is a place where we can find rest. That place is not in medicines or treatments, although they are important. That place is in the presence of the Most High, in the shadow of the Almighty, where we find true peace and true healing. The promise of the 91st Psalm is great, but for it to become a living reality, it takes more than just knowing it. Many people read this psalm, memorize its verses, and even keep it open in their homes, believing that this will bring automatic protection. But the true strength of this psalm is not in its words printed on paper, but in the active faith of those who appropriate its truths. How, then, can we apply this psalm to our daily lives? How to transform your promises into a real and concrete experience? The first step is to understand the depth of what it means to dwell in the secret place of the Most High. The psalm is not about an occasional search for God, but about living in His presence continually. Living is more than visiting. It means making a home, remaining in communion. Many turn to God only when facing crises, but the promise of protection is for those who make the Lord their constant refuge. This means developing a genuine prayer life, not based only on urgent requests, but on a daily and deep relationship with God. A powerful way to apply Psalm 91 is to use it as a personal prayer. Instead of just reading it, we can declare its words in faith, bringing each promise into our own reality. This can be done simply by adapting the verses to make them a personal confession. For example, instead of saying, "He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty," we can pray like this: "Lord, I choose to dwell in your secret place. I want to be under your shadow and rest in your presence." This practice is not a magical ritual, but an exercise of faith. The words of the psalm come alive when they are proclaimed with conviction. This is the essence of prayer. It is not just about repeating phrases, but about declaring spiritual truths with confidence. When we pray based on this psalm, we are aligning ourselves with God's will and strengthening our faith to face any adversity. Another fundamental aspect to apply Psalm 91 is the unshakable trust in divine protection. It is common for doubts and fears to arise when faced with illness. The human mind tends to focus on the worst-case scenario, and the heart is filled with uncertainty. However, true faith manifests itself when we choose to trust God, even when circumstances are contrary. The psalm reminds us that He will cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you will be safe. This means that there is a place of rest and security for those who choose to trust in God's care, even when the storm has not yet passed. But this trust needs to be accompanied by actions that demonstrate this faith. When Jesus healed the sick, He often said, "Your faith has saved you." This did not mean that faith alone was responsible for the miracle, but rather that he who fully trusts in God makes room for His power to manifest. The application of the 91st Psalm involves this same attitude. It is not just a psalm to be recited, but a truth to be lived. In addition to prayer and trust, another essential point is to align our lives with God's principles. The psalmist states that divine protection is for those who make the Lord their refuge. This implies total surrender, a life guided by the will of God. Many times, people want to experience God's blessings without being willing to live in obedience to Him. However, the promises of the 91st Psalm are for those who choose to be under the shadow of the Most High, which means walking according to His teachings. This is not to say that those who follow God will never face difficulties. The Bible itself shows that many faithful servants went through trials and illnesses. But the difference lies in the way we face these situations. Those who dwell in the hiding place of the Most High face challenges with the certainty that they are not alone, with the conviction that there is a God who cares and strengthens. Another essential point in applying this psalm is the practice of gratitude and worship. In times of illness, it is easy to focus only on the problem, forgetting to recognize God's goodness. But faith is strengthened when, instead of focusing on what is missing, we choose to praise God for what He has already done and what He will do. Praise is a powerful weapon against fear and anxiety. It reminds us that God remains in control and that His faithfulness never fails. Many people have experienced deliverance and healing by declaring and living the truths of the 91st Psalm. Stories of people who faced impossible diagnoses but found strength and restoration by standing on divine promises are living testimonies that this psalm is not just a beautiful text, but a reality that can transform lives. When we choose to make it a part of our daily lives, not just as a routine reading, but as an active expression of faith, we begin to see the manifestation of God's power in concrete ways. Applying the 91st Psalm to daily life means more than just reading it occasionally. It is living each day in the presence of God, trusting Him above any circumstance, praying with faith, aligning yourself with His principles, and maintaining a grateful heart. When we do this, we discover that this is not just an ancient promise, but an eternal truth that continues to bring healing, protection, and peace to those who choose to dwell in the shadow of the Almighty. Over the centuries, the 91st Psalm has been a source of hope for countless people who have faced illness, tragedy, and impossible challenges. His words were proclaimed in times of war, recited in hospital beds, written on prison walls, and kept in the hearts of those who sought refuge in the midst of chaos. But what makes this psalm so special? Why do so many witness miracles and deliverances by relying on these promises? There are amazing accounts of people who have experienced God's healing and protection as they declared the 91st Psalm in faith. During World War II, for example, there are stories of soldiers who carried small copies of this psalm with them and believed it would protect them from the dangers of the battlefield. Many of these fighters returned home unharmed, testifying that, even amid the explosions and horror of war, they felt a supernatural peace that guided and guarded them. Another striking story involves a group of missionaries who, during a deadly epidemic in a remote village, decided to remain there to care for the sick, even though they knew the disease was spreading rapidly. While many around them succumbed to illness, these missionaries declared daily the promises of the 91st Psalm, trusting in divine protection. Inexplicably, none of them were affected by the disease, and their presence in that place brought hope and healing to many. These stories are not just isolated reports. Throughout history, men and women who chose to trust God and dwell under the shadow of the Most High have experienced extraordinary deliverances. But there is something important to understand. The power is not just in the repetition of the words of the psalm, but in the living faith that places itself entirely in God's hands. The psalmist does not present a magic formula against suffering, but rather a call to absolute trust in the one who has all the power. Many people have witnessed miraculous healings as they stand on the promises of this psalm. There are reports of terminally ill people who were restored without medical explanation, of irreversible diagnoses that were transformed by an unexpected divine action. In each of these stories, the common denominator is genuine faith, which clings to the promise that God is a refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. But the miracle doesn't always happen the way we expect. Some healings don't happen instantly. Some battles against illness are long and require perseverance. However, even in these cases, there are testimonies of people who, even in the midst of pain, found supernatural peace by taking refuge in God. Instead of being dominated by fear, they discovered a deep rest in the knowledge that they were under the wings of the Most High. The 91st Psalm does not promise a life without challenges, but it assures us that we will never face those challenges alone. He reminds us that there is a God who surrounds us with His presence, who strengthens us when we are weak, and who sustains us in times of uncertainty. This is the true miracle, knowing that, regardless of the circumstances, we are never helpless. As we look at the testimonies of protection and healing throughout history, we realize that the essence of this psalm is unshakable trust in the character of God. He is true to His word. He takes care of His children. He covers us with His wings and gives us security, whether by freeing us from illness or giving us the strength to face it with faith and courage. And this certainty remains alive for all those who choose to make the Lord their refuge. The 91st Psalm is more than an ancient text. It is an invitation, a call to trust God, to dwell in His presence, and to find refuge under His wings. Through the generations, it has been a stronghold for those facing illness, fear, and uncertainty. His words not only offer comfort, but also reveal a powerful truth. God is our protector, the one who keeps us through the storms of life. But that promise demands a response. It is not enough to just know the words of the psalm or have it open at home as if it were an amulet. True security comes when we choose to live according to that faith, when we decide to make the Lord our refuge. This means trusting God not just in moments of despair, but every day, developing a genuine relationship with Him. The great message of Psalm 91 is not just about the absence of dangers, but about the certainty that God is with us in any circumstance. He frees us from hidden traps, protects us from invisible threats, and gives us strength to face any illness. The security we find in His words is not limited to the physical, but extends to the soul and spirit, bringing peace even in the face of the greatest challenges. Often, the healing we seek does not happen immediately, and the path of faith teaches us that God does not always act according to our expectations. However, when we lean into the promises of this psalm, we discover that the greatest healing of all is not just the restoration of the body, but the transformation of the heart. The true miracle is finding rest in the presence of God, having peace even when the winds blow strong, knowing that we are protected by the love of the One who never fails. Given this, what is left for us to do? The answer is simple. Choose to trust. Choosing to declare this truth over our lives. Choosing to dwell in the shadow of the Most High and live under the certainty that He is faithful. The 91st Psalm remains a refuge for those who take it for themselves, not just as an inspirational text, but as a living reality. And this reality is available to everyone, for those who face illness, for those who fear the future, for those who need hope. God remains the same, and His promises remain firm. He who makes the Lord his shelter rests in security, because he knows that, regardless of what happens, he is protected by a love that never shakes. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so we can continue to bring you more research and in-depth analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps the channel grow and produce even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support. If you've made it this far, you now know the power of Psalm 91 and how it can transform your life. But this journey doesn't end here. There is much more to discover about the Word of God and how to apply it in your everyday life. So, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss upcoming content. Leave your like so that this message reaches even more people, and share it with someone who needs this word of faith and protection. And don't stop here. In the next video, we will explore another essential topic that can further strengthen your spiritual journey. Click now and continue on this journey.